Welcome to the third episode of Academic Afterlife, a podcast where we find out about different career paths that PhDs can take after their days in academia are over. Today we are joined by Ali Divan. He is the founder of Trulitica, where he mentors PhDs how to break into biotech industry. Today he will talk to us about his experience in product development. With a background in medical sciences, and more specifically in immunology, I'm sure that he will have a lot of advice and career tips that many of PhDs can use. Ali, welcome.
Thanks, Maya.
So, nice to have you here. And as I usually start with this question, you are not going to be any different. Can you tell me a bit more about your background, more specifically, just so that the viewers and listeners can connect and see if they could be potential candidates for the product development job? Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. So I did my PhD at Texas A&M in medical science. There I was focusing on animal models of infectious disease and looking at how the immune system responded to that specifically, specifically in the central nervous system. From there, I went and did a postdoc at the University of North Dakota in a microbiology lab. Our funding ran out after about a year, and so I ended up switching over to a medicinal chemistry lab at the same university. At that time, I sort of already made up my mind that industry was the place for me. So while I was postdocing, I was also actively looking for industrial roles in the biotech space and places where I was sort of familiar. I ended up getting a role at a major antibody company here in San Diego, moved the whole family out over a course of 3 weeks just before the North Dakota winter hit. And from there, I was initially hired on in a quality control role. I was the only scientist in the quality control department. A lot of troubleshooting and teaching and data analysis on their flow cytometry products, on their multiplex products, ELISA products, all antibody-based systems. There I ended up becoming lead on the tech transfer team, where I did a lot of remediation in terms of methodology and some of the documentation in terms of how do you get a product to be scalable and to meet the specifications, because ultimately we were having a good problem, which was the demand for our products was growing so much that we had to scale it. And so we had to come up with a process for that. After that, I was promoted to the manager of operations and product development in the proteogenomics unit at the same company. And there I was involved in the launch of some of their multiomics products, which ended up being a big hit, and they still are to this day. I then went on to a diagnostic company where I worked in the laboratory on formulations and technology transfer for some of the diagnostic products. Then went on over to a company that was focusing on spatial multiomics, specifically spatial imaging. Developed some really interesting methods there for getting rid of autofluorescence in the brain, which is a big problem in that field. That company, we ended up, the San Diego site ended up getting shut down, just because of financial reasons. And that's a reality of life, both in academia and in an industry that as scientists we need to be prepared for. And then went and was a founding scientist at another multi-omics startup, spent some time there, and then eventually left and started my own business to really pursue my passion, which is mentoring people. That was the thing that I enjoyed the most when I was in industry, is mentoring my direct reports. And so here at Trulitica, I'm mentoring and advising people, specifically life science PhDs, on how to break into the biotech industry. And that's something that I really struggled with, and I know there are a lot of resources out there, but getting that one-on-one advising and being able to really connect with somebody and fast track your transition, someone you trust, that's a tough one to get. So that's how I ended up here where I am today. And today I'm happy to provide a little bit more insight in terms of the role that I had in product development and operations and what those things mean.
Yeah, thanks. There was a lot of careers in one answer, I have to admit.
Yeah.
But it shows that there is, a possibility for a transfer once you get your step in. Is maybe not that difficult to change your job. Um, can you tell me? So you said now you are offering advice to young PhDs. Is this maybe from an experience because you're trying to sort of, let's say, be the mentor you wanted, or you are inspired by someone to start this business?
A little bit of both. So it was very difficult for me to break into industry, even though I had people supporting me emotionally. Right, people were in my camp saying, "Yeah, you should do this." My PIs were very encouraging of it, which is actually not that typical based on people I speak to. So there's that aspect of it. The other aspect is that I didn't mention this, but when I was in industry, I was also a hiring manager. So I did a lot of hiring. I made a lot of hiring decisions. And what I ended up seeing on LinkedIn was like, there's a lot of stuff out there that I was like, what are they talking about? That's just made up. And so I figured, look, I've made these decisions. I've interviewed people. I've screened people. I know how hard it is. I love mentoring people. Why don't I take these things together? There's a big demand for it, and people want it, and they end up in better situations. Just seeing somebody where after they've applied for 100 jobs, gotten zero interviews, and then they work with me for a little bit, and then they end up in the course of on average 3 months getting the job they want, doubling their salary, and being treated like depending on which lab you came from, being treated so much better. It's just a win for everybody involved, and I really like seeing that because you get to make a lasting impact on somebody's life.
I think, of course, it's the most amazing thing in the world to work a job where actually you feel fulfilled, and you feel like you're doing a great thing every day. There's no better motivation to get out of bed. But of
Yeah.
course, being a mentor like you are and leading people and giving a career advice would not be possible without having a career first, I believe. So,
Yeah.
can you tell us a bit more about specifically your experience in product development in biotech? How did you get into it? What is even this? What does it entail, this job?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, a lot of inventions on the academic side are treated as products, even though they're not. There's a big leap to go from invention to product. So, an invention is a new technology. Maybe it's patentable, maybe it's not. But just because you invented a thing doesn't mean that anybody wants it. And it's also possible that you invented a thing that people want, but it's not scalable, or it's not cost efficient, or it's illegal because in certain countries because of certain components in there that aren't legal in those countries. So there's a lot of nuance here where you can have something great, but if you don't have the right messaging, or you don't have the right design, or if you don't really understand your customer, you're going to end up in a situation where you have 2,000 of something just sitting on a shelf not being sold. Or worse, it is being sold and it is absolutely not meeting the customer's needs, and then you get a lot of complaints. And so product development is going from idea to end result that meets the user's needs. That's in a nutshell what it is. Um, there are there's several different aspects of it that I'd be happy to break down. Ultimately, it's like an 8-step process is what I sort of consider it as. But what I would like to say is that the product development that I'm describing is specific to a process called design controls, which is representative of the medical device standard. That medical device standard is called ISO 13485. It's not a regulatory thing. You opt into it. But very often companies opt into it because it demonstrates that they have high quality and reproducibility. And it's a huge value add for customers. It's essentially giving them a guarantee about what they're receiving.
Okay, interesting. So, but is this kind of so since you said in academia when there is an invention, so I'm just thinking about possibilities. So it could be that, for example, you work as a scientist, you invent an amazing material, and then you develop your own product, or you can also be hired. So you would work as a freelancer, or alternatively, you're hired by a company and they ask you like, we found an invention, or like, we have an invention and we want you to put it on the market. So are both options possible? Have you heard of some stories like
Oh,
that?
yeah, sure. So I was just trying to explain that when we invent something in academia, we usually just make the mental leap that, okay, now I'm going to make $1 million or $10 million, and that it's not that linear. There's a lot more to it. But to get into product development, you don't have to invent anything. That's not a requirement. If you do invent something and you want to end up, running with that, generally the path is you end up going through a tech transfer office at the university, filing. You generally need some level of intellectual property, some way of giving yourself a competitive advantage and excluding others from doing so. Um, and then very often you end up going down the entrepreneurial route where you start your own startup. You end up getting some funding from angel investors, and kind of build it out that way. You can go down the licensing route where you have some technology and you're saying, hey, big company, I've invented this thing. Would you like to license it from me? Um, that's a little bit of a fantasy. There are very few companies that do that. Generally, companies already have technology. They're not looking to buy others' technology. And if they are, they want proof that it's productizable. They may acquire another company, but they're not going to acquire some 25-year-old's invention from an academic laboratory that they have no idea. Does anyone want it? Is it scalable? Is it reproducible? What's the shelf life? Stuff like that.
And in the end, will it be a profitable investment, right?
Of course. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, of
Like
course.
it needs to, if it doesn't make money, they're not going to be interested.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we know a bit more about the general background of this job. But when I would, for example, be hired as a product development developer, what could I expect? I show up at my office with a coffee mug, or I show up in a lab, or I go to a library, or I don't know. What is a
Yeah.
typical day of a product developer look like?
Yeah. So in the biotech space, especially at an entry level role, very often you'll be hired in as like scientist one or scientist two, product development, or it could be labeled as assay development. Those things can be interchangeable depending on the company. Sometimes your customer is someone else in the company. So there are companies that have like very big pipelines where maybe the asset you're developing is to test a cell therapy, and that's what gets commercialized. So in that case, you're more likely to be assay development, and your customer is internal. Same principles apply, except for the profitability part. The If you end up in a situation where you're developing assays or products that are commercialized to the market, then it's a little bit more rigorous. But back to your question, what do you do? So you would expect to walk in to the office, probably spend maybe 20 to 30% of your time doing analysis, reading literature, maybe looking at some product specs. But most of your time is going to be in the laboratory, troubleshooting, testing, demonstrating that certain specifications are met. And then the rest of it is going to be sort of putting together presentations and documentation to demonstrate that those things are met. So when you're coming in an entry level role, you're not going to be just set out on your own to just figure that all out by yourself. You're generally going to be reporting to somebody who has experience in this, and they'll say, okay, here's how the product development process works. Here's where we are in that process. Here's what you need to do to get to get us to the next phase of that process. And so then you have a very measurable set of things you have to do. And there are situations where you might do all of your testing and go, you know what, this actually doesn't work based on this parameter. And so then a decision needs to be made. Okay, well, do we want to continue pursuing this, or do we need to make a modification? And very often the answer is we just need to make a small adjustment, and that generally resolves the issue.
Okay. One question that I have in mind here is So how long is, for example, does it take from a product like an invention idea that shows up into a company before you say, okay, I'm done with this project. Finally, I have a new one. So how long is this period? I mean, I know it can vary a lot, but I guess
Yeah,
in the
yeah, yeah.
biotech industry.
It's a super good question. So it depends on what you're making. If you're making equipment like a complex instrument, it could be 3 to 5 years, maybe longer, just because there's so much engineering and so much hardware and things that really need to be rigorously tested. If you're designing an assay, a little bit shorter, but it also depends on, has your company ever made something similar? If your company has ever made something similar, then there are parts of product development that you don't have to reinvent. You can say, okay, we're going to inherit the data from that thing, and the only part that's different is what we'll test. And so that really fast tracks it. So if it's your first product that you're launching as a company, it's not unusual for it to take 1 to 2 years to launch that. If it's something that is sort of what you specialize in and you've launched many of these before, generally 3 to 6 months is what you're looking at, because you already have the systems in place.
When you mentioned testing, did you mean testing as in you go to a lab and test around this project, or you tell someone else to do it, or does it mean, I don't know, maybe testing in some kind of inside of a different software or something? I'm not sure.
Both, all of the above. Yeah. So this is where the different phases kind of break down. Do you want me to go over the different phases now?
Sure, I'm happy to learn about product development.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it all starts with, in the ideal scenario, if you do everything in the right order, it actually starts with marketing. And marketing reaches out to prospective customers to see what is it that they don't have that they wish they had. Most of the time, this gives you the answer that you need. There are some situations where, for example, if you're making something so innovative and so new that no one has imagined it, they can't tell you that. Like they're not going to. There's like some example with Henry Ford where if you were to have asked him, what if he were to have asked people what they want, they would have said faster horses. They wouldn't have said they wanted a car, because that was a new thing. No one could imagine that. But that's rare. Most of the time, people are aware of what the gaps are in the market. And so this is all about customer research and understanding what are the requirements that the users have. From there, you come up with a commercialization plan. And so this is, again, on marketing to say, okay, here's the thing that's wanted. Here's a list of what that thing has to do, like performance requirements that are sort of general. So then you have to say, okay, well, who are we selling this to? Is our market global? Is our market USA only? Is our market USA and Taiwan, USA and China? Like, where are we selling this? And then do we have distributors in those locations? Or are we just going to be shipping it direct from US? And what's the shipping channel? Because those will ultimately impact the shipping containers and what goes in the shipping containers, how resilient they have to be against vibration, and all the subsequent downstream testing. So once you get that sorted out, then you go down the scientist track. So everything that I described so far, generally I was not involved in. I was the recipient of those things. So I would get those things and I go, okay, this is what we need. And so then you need to translate that into what are called design inputs. So design inputs are taking these general user requirements and turning them into an internal requirement. And so an example that I give is that supposedly a user says, you know what, this product, it needs to be stable for 2 weeks at room temperature. That's about all they're going to say. They're not going to say, oh, it needs to be in a vial that's this size and have this kind of cap. They generally don't get that specific. And so then you need to translate that to something a little bit more specific. And it needs to be compatible with your systems. So you would translate that to product must be stable for at least 12 weeks at a range of 4 to 8 degrees Celsius. So why do we go from 2 weeks to 12 weeks? Because we have to manufacture it and we have to store it. So it needs to be stable for 2 weeks in the customer's hands, but for us, that might mean 12 weeks in our hands. So that gives us some time to have it sit on the shelf before we sell it. There are a lot of other aspects that go into design inputs. So these can be things like even just a performance specification. So for a particular antibody, like a T cell, an antibody that identifies like CD4 T cells, you might say, okay, must produce when tested in if it's targeting like mouse splenocytes. When tested in mouse splenocytes, must produce percent positive population of within the range of X to Y. And so then now that's your performance specification. And what's important, and this is something that I think academics, scientists struggle with when they're coming into industry, is that specifications are never one number. They're always a range, because you end up with a measurement problem if they're one number. If you say, oh, it needs to be 4%, it's 4 point what? 4.0 plus or minus what? And then as soon as you get the plus or minus, then now you have a range. And so it just gives you flexibility and allows you to be specific. So you've done all of these things. You've basically set up your goalpost. You've said, okay, here's the requirement for the product. Now you have to prove to yourself that it's achievable. And you have to come up with methods and standard operating procedures on how to deliver these things, including something as simple as how do you make this buffer? You need a clear work instruction that whoever is in the laboratory can follow that and get the same result every time. And so you do all of your preliminary testing, you get some data, you write all of your preliminary documents. If it's equipment or an instrument, you have blueprints for it. All of these things together are the results of you testing your design inputs. And this is the developer that's doing the testing. It's someone on the product development team. The result of those are called design outputs. And that makes sense. You have an input, you have an output. And so this is where at every phase, you're going to stop and meet with the team, all of the relevant stakeholders, and you're going to say, okay, here are the design inputs. Do you agree? Yes or no? Is anything clear? Yes or unclear? Yes or no? Then at the design output side, you say, okay, here was what we wanted. Here's what we got. And then here are all of our documents. And you have all of the relevant stakeholders look at it. This can include your manufacturing team, your marketing team, your quality assurance team, quality control. If it's something that's being used in humans or could have some FDA oversight, could be your regulatory affairs team as well. And from there, if you think that you met your requirements, then you say, okay, you sign off on it, you move to the next phase. If you don't, then you say, okay, we're going to have a design freeze, which means nothing moves forward. And then you have to go back to your design inputs and change them. You say, okay, this is no longer what our design input is. The output informed that this is what it needs to be. If you can't change your design inputs, then you have to change something about your methodology to achieve that goalpost. So that's how you end up getting to the next phase. So everything you do on the design output side, you can imagine as preliminary data for a grant. You don't necessarily need to have a high end. It does need to be reproducible. It does need to be convincing, but it's not like something you would show the world. So the next step is, what would I show the world? What could I say like without a doubt is the result? So this step is called design verification. And so this involves statistics. It involves scaling, making like slightly larger batches. And it involves following those directions that you made to a T. And so generally this process can take 3 months, 4 months, sometimes longer, depending on the complexity of it. This is where your developers are going to be essentially testing it as if they were the customer, as if this is a real product that they're going to send out. If you find that your design verification still meets all of your design inputs and that there are no issues with any of your work instructions or anything like that for internal usage, then you say, okay, we're ready to move over to design validation. On the validation side, the difference is validation is about meeting the user requirements. Verification is about meeting the internal design inputs. So on the validation side, now you really are either shipping something early out to a early access customer, or you're having a different department in the company that was not involved in the development of this product test it as if they're a customer. So now instead of using these internal work instructions, they're using the commercial work instructions, which we call instructions for use. So now they're really imagining that, hey, they bought this from you and they're just going to read like word for word everything that's in the kit. They're going to use it and see what results they get. And then you're going to get some kind of feedback about that. And very often, this is where things arise in terms of, hey, you misinterpreted that requirement. Or, you know what? There was a hidden requirement we didn't tell you about when you asked us, but now that we're using it, we're realizing, oh yeah, you know what, that's going to be a problem. And it can be something as silly as these caps are really hard to unscrew. And then you go, oh, we got to adjust the torque setting on our capper. And that might be it, but that's a huge deal because if 1,000 people are annoyed with your product because their fingers hurt after uncapping it, they'll just buy from someone else. And so that's super valuable feedback to get something out the door to somebody. So the last two steps are design transfer and product launch. So design transfer is generally what happens is that your first lot is made by your development team, but every lot thereafter is going to be made by your manufacturing team. So design transfer is the act of technology transfer from one business unit in the company to another business unit. And so this involves handing off the internal work instructions, making sure you validated all the different scales that things are going to be tested at. Very often, if companies are having the validation step involve another internal business unit, design transfer and validation happen together. If they're having the validation step be done by a customer, then design transfer is a separate step. And so it really just depends on your product and what your team decides is the best approach. What I find is that design transfer is the step that's most often underestimated. People go, oh, it'll be fine, just give them the work instructions. And I think this is analogous to, you see some big paper published in Science or Cell or something, you contact the lab and you say, hey, can you give me the protocol for that? And they send you the protocol and you're never able to reproduce anything they did. And it's not because their work is irreproducible, it's because there's key details that have been left out, key assumptions that have been made. And so that's how you fix those problems, to make it so that anybody ever could do it. And then the last step is product launch. So once you have all those things set, then you're talking about updating the website, talking about getting your sales team prepared to sell. And most of these things are happening in parallel. It's not like, because this can take a long time, so it's not like you just say, okay, I'm done, and then you spend a week training people. This is getting your technical support team to very often test the product, or at least have a good idea of how to troubleshoot, and just have your systems updated and ready to get feedback. If there's any feedback from the customer, then you launch and you sell. And if you do it well, you will sell way more than you thought you would.
Which is a good thing for the company.
Good problem to have. Yeah, good problem to have. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for this really, really big answer. What I actually recognized in your answer is that, of course, there are different kinds of PhDs, but some of the PhDs, they actually, let's say, during their thesis developing, they are actually focused on maybe optimizing or perfecting a process inside the lab in order for their method to work. So for them, going into product development would be like a natural next step if they want to transition to industry, right?
Yeah, I think if you've done a lot of method development in your training, and you've seen how things can fail and done a lot of troubleshooting, I think that this can be a good role for you. One of the challenges, I think, in terms of just for any PhD getting into industry is realizing that you're part of a team now, and that there's a lot of moving parts. You can't have control over all of it, and it's not going to be perfect. And that's something that was hard for me, is that you don't have to have everything be perfect. And really understanding what the goalpost is of quote unquote acceptable is the most important thing. You have to understand what your customer wants. It doesn't have to be the most perfect thing in the world. It just needs to meet their needs. And I think the other challenging part is that in our PhD training, we're constantly made to defend our decisions. We're constantly made to demonstrate that we're competent. And what happens is, I think I don't know if it's intentionally or not, we end up having this need to always be right and to always be the smartest person in the room. And if anybody's wrong, we have to like criticize them or like be like, oh, well, what about this and what about, and that it doesn't work that way in the business world. You gotta learn to let stuff go, and you can control what you're responsible for. If somebody else is responsible for something, you can express a different viewpoint or concern. But it doesn't. You don't have to have everything be perfect for a product launch to go well.
Yeah, likewise, you don't have to have everything perfect for a PhD to
True.
defend it in the end. You know, you have to have a story that people will, in the end, believe you, right? But
Yeah.
yeah, okay, interesting. So, for all of those who would have developed or optimized their processes during the PhD, this might be a great career choice for you. Um, so another question I would have is, what would be the top three skills that are important for, yeah, a good product developer in biotech?
Yeah, I would say having being able to look at things big picture is really important. If you get too focused in the granular details, you can lose sight of the overall mission, and the purpose of the product. And I would say another really important aspect is being able to communicate, and understanding who you should give what level of detail to. If you're talking to another developer, it's fine to go into detail. If you're meeting with your quality assurance team, they may not need that level of detail. They want to make sure you're meeting the ISO standards. If you're meeting with your product manager, they might want something in between. They might want less detail than a developer would want, but a little bit more detail than quality assurance would want. And so I think it's being able to tailor your message to your audience and having practice and communication, and presentation. They're very helpful traits to have. They're not requirements, but you will excel in that, if you can bring that to the table.
Okay, so being able to see the big picture and communication definitely are important. And I mean, when you do a lot of presentations as a PhD student, hopefully you also learn how to maybe transfer some of your ideas to the language of people who are not necessarily experts in only your field, right? So that could be also a beneficial trait.
Yeah, I mean, very very often it goes further than that, in industry, because very often you're communicating with people who are not scientists, and so it's not just about scientifically communicating your expertise to another scientific expert. It's communicating the relevant parts of what you're talking about to someone who may not be a scientist.
And actually, I was wondering, is there maybe a product that you see that you can see on a shelf and you can walk by and think, aha, I developed that product? I mean, you don't have to
You
mention any
can, yeah,
names.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean,
So
is it
I
true for you?
Yes, yeah. I will say though that it wasn't just me; it was a huge team. But what I say is I was involved in that, and so a lot of the work that was done during the COVID pandemic in terms of multiplexing reagents that were tested, and multiomics reagents, I was either involved in the technology transfer for that, or I was involved in the development and launch for that, and that felt really good.
Really good. Okay, cool. But thank you for doing that.
Well,
um,
I mean, I didn't know that it would result in that. Like that. That's the cool thing, is that you develop something with the intent of it being useful to the world. You have no idea what people are going to do with it, and what they do with it is their own ideas, their own discoveries, and you get to say like, "Oh, cool." It's like if you invent a bike and then some pro biker goes and does like a bunch of backflips off of a jump with it, you're like, well, you wouldn't have expected that, but you made the bike. Yeah.
And I mean, I think in general, how I'm hearing it, it is a nice career. For example, one of the things for me as a PhD was that I was doing different types of research, but what I actually wanted to see in the end, for it to have some sort of a, let's say, purpose in the end. And here I feel as a product developer, you're developing something that has to have a purpose. Otherwise, you would not be working on that project. And yeah, I mean, I think that sounds like a nicer balance, like for me personally, right? Because in the end, I get to see it on the shelf, and maybe it helps saves someone's life, or someone helps someone to do a backflip. Yeah,
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 certainly can. That's the nice thing about having the market give you feedback is that in general, at least in biotech, the market is not going to reward something that doesn't produce value. So if you put a product out there that's not very useful, it's probably not going to sell.
okay, yeah. And one more question I had is like, what is the percentage of people with a PhD background would you meet in a product development line of work inside biotech?
Probably all of them. Yeah,
Probably all of them. Okay, so
yeah,
that's
yeah.
promising. Sounds
There,
good.
there certainly are
Yeah.
exceptions, but the general norm, I would say probably 90% or more of people in that role have PhDs and have a lot of lab experience.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think I gathered really a lot of useful information about the process of product development and how it works in biotech. I am really grateful you joined us or joined me for this podcast. Um, I don't know, is there some final advice you would want to give to the listeners or viewers about breaking into biotech, and maybe remind us where you are reachable?
Yeah, sure. I think the first thing I would say is, when you look at job descriptions and you get feedback from recruiters and you're constantly getting rejected, it can feel hopeless. You can feel like you're not good enough. And I know that the graduate school experience very often leaves people with a highly sought after degree and like very low self esteem. And so, what I would say is don't give up. Don't be afraid to take a chance on yourself. Realize that you don't have to meet every single little requirement, um, and ask for help. Reach out to people who have done the thing before and ask them for some advice and guidance. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. I have a lot of resources on my website. In fact, a lot of what I covered today, I published in a blog on my website, and so it helped me to go through it and remember all the steps. But there's a lot of great free resources out there. There's great paid resources too. So you got to start somewhere, and where you start will be rejection, but it will eventually turn into something you want.
Okay, thank you for those nice and kind words. I hope they help someone, inspire someone. And yeah, I hope to talk to you again soon. Thank you very
Thanks a
much.
lot, Maya.
And yeah, bye.